It is Monday morning, and somewhere in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, American soldiers are standing over the wreckage of an Iranian drone they just finished detonating. Routine work. The kind of controlled demolition American EOD teams have done 1,000 times. Except this time, something goes wrong, and by the time the dust clears, a United States service member is dead. Not in a firefight, not in a missile strike, in a routine detonation that turned fatal in seconds. That is service member number 3 in 4 days.
And within hours, American aircraft are back over Iranian skies for the 9th consecutive night, hitting bridges, power stations, and infrastructure across a southern Iranian province that sits right on the edge of the Strait of Hormuz.
The president lands in Maryland from a World Cup appearance, walks up to reporters, and says 5 words that tell you everything about where this is headed. We hit them very hard. So let's actually slow down and ask the question most coverage is skipping past. Why did this specific death, the third in a matter of days, become the trigger for America hitting harder instead of pulling back? Because the honest answer isn't really about one soldier. It's about a peace deal that just quietly died. A waterway carrying 1/5 of the world's oil that's turning into a war zone, and a retaliation cycle that's now pulling in 3 more countries who never asked to be part of this. Let's get into what actually happened, why the talks collapsed, and where this goes next. To understand why this death mattered so much, you have to understand what happened just before it. 2 American service members had already been killed Friday when Iran launched missile and drone attacks against a base in Jordan. In the chaos afterward, searchers found unidentified remains at that same site, and as of this weekend, the military still hasn't confirmed whether that 3rd set of remains belongs to another American or not. Then, separately, in Iraq's Kurdistan region, a service member died during what should have been a safe, controlled destruction of an unexploded Iranian drone. 3 dead, 1 status still unconfirmed, all inside 4 days. That is the fastest run of American combat deaths since this war with Iran began back in February. And this is the part that matters most for understanding what happens next. This wasn't a random spike in violence. It landed at the exact moment ceasefire talks between Washington and Tehran had already fallen apart. For weeks, both sides had been negotiating a memorandum of understanding centered on one specific flashpoint: control and safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz. That single stretch of water is the choke point through which roughly 1/5 of the world's oil physically has to pass. Whoever effectively controls transit through it holds leverage over energy markets from Tokyo to Rotterdam. The talks broke down over exactly that question, and once they broke down, both sides stopped pretending there was an off-ramp. 9 straight nights of American strikes followed. This is now, by any reasonable definition, an active shooting war, not a series of retaliatory strikes with a ceasefire waiting in the wings. Here's what a lot of coverage is missing. Though everyone is treating America hits Iran harder as the headline. But the more revealing headline is what Iran did in response, because it tells you this: conflict has already outgrown the 2 countries fighting it. Iran didn't just fire back at American bases. It hit Kuwait's power grid and water desalination plants directly, a country whose entire modern existence depends on turning seawater into drinking water. It struck Bahrain, home to the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet, putting a direct American naval hub in the blast radius. And in the strait itself, Iran claims to have disabled 2 oil tankers that tried to transit without its permission, while the British military separately confirmed a ship burning off the Omani coast nearby. Nobody has publicly confirmed whether that burning vessel was targeted deliberately or caught in the crossfire, and that uncertainty is, on its own, a kind of answer. When you can't tell anymore whether a tanker fire was intentional or incidental, the strait has effectively stopped being a shipping lane and started being a battlefield. Let's talk about what that's doing to the numbers that actually reach you, because this is where an abstract Middle East conflict turns into something you feel at the pump. Benchmark crude broke past $90 a barrel on Monday and kept climbing. That's not a blip. That's the market pricing in the real possibility that the world's most important oil choke point stays contested for weeks, not days. Washington had already reimposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports days earlier, and some shipping companies have started quietly rerouting around the strait entirely, adding time, fuel cost, and insurance premiums that eventually land on every product that ever touched a cargo ship. This is the part that turns a regional military story into a story about your gas bill, your grocery prices, and every supply chain that runs through the Gulf. And it's worth being precise about why this specific choke point matters more than almost any other stretch of water on the planet. There is no easy detour around the Strait of Hormuz. Tankers that reroute around the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula add days to their voyage, burn significantly more fuel doing it, and still can't fully replace the volume that normally moves through that single, narrow passage. Insurance underwriters have already started pricing war risk premiums into any vessel scheduled to transit the strait in the coming weeks, and those premiums get passed straight down the chain to shipping companies, to fuel distributors, to the price on the pump nearest you. This is why a single burning tanker off the Omani coast matters so much more than one incident should. It's not just a ship, it's a signal to every insurer and shipping company on Earth that the safest oil corridor in the world just stopped being safe. Before we go further, it's worth sitting with why this particular death triggered escalation instead of restraint, because the pattern isn't new. Go back to the Gulf War, to the tanker attacks of the 1980s, to nearly every prior flashpoint in this region, and you'll find the same rule holding true. Ceasefire talks rarely collapse over ideology. It collapses over the boring, technical details nobody outside the negotiating room ever hears about. A definition, a boundary line, an inspection clause. In this case, it was the exact wording of who controls passage through Hormuz and under what conditions. That kind of collapse doesn't make for a dramatic headline, so it gets buried under the more visible story of soldiers dying and bombs falling. But it's the actual hinge point. Once that clause failed, both governments lost the face-saving off-ramp they needed to stop without looking like they'd back down. And once that off-ramp disappears, every subsequent death, no matter how it happens, stops being treated as a tragedy to be investigated and starts being treated as a reason to escalate. There's another angle almost nobody is covering, and it's the one I think matters most for where this goes over the next month. This war is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening while China continues quietly drawing down its own oil stockpiles instead of bidding aggressively into a spiking market, while Russia watches a rival power get dragged deeper into a Middle Eastern quagmire it can't easily exit. And while Gulf states that have spent a decade trying to diversify away from oil dependence watch their desalination plants and power grids get hit by exactly the kind of country-level conflict they built billion-dollar sovereign wealth funds to insulate themselves from. None of these countries need to fire a single shot to benefit from this conflict dragging on. Every extra night of strikes is a night American military bandwidth, diplomatic attention, and political capital stays fixed on the Gulf instead of anywhere else. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just what happens to global power balances when one major military gets tied down in a war with no clear exit. Now, here's where I want to bring in the piece almost nobody is talking about, honestly, because it doesn't fit neatly into either side's narrative. This war didn't start with the deaths making headlines this week. It started back on February 28th, when American and Israeli strikes hit Iran in a coordinated operation, an operation that, within days, killed Iran's supreme leader. Since then, by America's own count, 17 U.S. military personnel have now been killed. Iran's government says over 3,000 Iranians have died, the overwhelming majority of them civilians, and that includes a strike on a girls' school that killed more than 160 children and 14 adults. The U.S. military has publicly acknowledged it still hasn't completed a full review of that strike. I'm not saying that to draw a moral equivalence or to tell you who's right. I'm saying it because you cannot understand why Iran keeps escalating instead of folding if you only count the American dead. Every retaliatory strike Iran launches, it launches believing it's already absorbing catastrophic losses with nothing left to lose by hitting back harder. That's not a justification. It's the actual mechanism driving the escalation you're watching play out night after night. There's also a quieter story unfolding in Jordan that deserves attention, because it shows how this war is dragging in countries that never wanted a piece of it. Iran claims its missiles hit American transport and command aircraft at the airport in Aqaba, a resort city, not a frontline military base. That claim hasn't been independently confirmed. But the U.S. Embassy had already warned Americans days earlier to stay away from that exact airport and seaport, and Jordan's government had publicly denied there was any specific threat right before Iranian missiles reportedly struck anyway. Jordan is a small kingdom whose population is already furious about the broader regional war, and whose government has spent years trying to keep a large but low-profile American military presence exactly that, low profile. Every strike that lands inside Jordan's borders makes that quiet arrangement harder to sustain. If Jordan's domestic politics shift because of this, that's a second front opening that has nothing to do with Iran's nuclear program or the Strait of Hormuz, and everything to do with a government trying to survive its own public opinion.
So where does that leave things right now? Honestly, here's what we actually know. 3, possibly 4 American service members are dead in the last 4 days. American strikes are now in their 9th consecutive night, with no sign of slowing. Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan have all absorbed direct hits, despite not being primary combatants in this war.
Oil is trading above $90 a barrel and climbing. And the diplomatic framework that was supposed to prevent exactly this outcome has already collapsed once. Here's what we genuinely don't know, and I'd rather tell you that plainly than pretend otherwise. We don't know if that unidentified set of remains found in Jordan belongs to a 4th American service member, and until the identification process finishes, that number could change at any moment. We don't know whether the tanker that caught fire near Oman was deliberately targeted or simply caught in an increasingly chaotic strait, and that distinction matters enormously for how the international community responds. We don't know whether Jordan's government can keep managing domestic anger over hosting American forces while Iranian missiles keep landing inside its borders. And we don't know whether either side actually wants this memorandum of understanding revived, or whether both governments have quietly decided that continuing to fight serves their political interests better than returning to the table. Anyone telling you they know exactly how many more nights of strikes this goes on, or exactly when the strait reopens to normal shipping, is guessing, not reporting. What we do know is this: a single death during a routine drone detonation in Iraq, combined with 2 deaths in Jordan just days earlier, was enough to end any pretense of restraint on either side. 9 nights of strikes later, 3 Gulf countries have taken direct hits. Oil markets are pricing in a prolonged crisis, and the one diplomatic path that could have stopped this is sitting broken on a table in Doha. This is not a story about one dead soldier anymore, if it ever really was. It's a story about how quickly a controlled, ceasefire-adjacent conflict becomes an uncontrolled regional war the moment the diplomatic off-ramp disappears. And once you understand that a memorandum about a shipping lane is what actually collapsed here, not just another round of retaliation, you start to see why hitting them very hard doesn't read like a strategy. It reads like the only move left, once talking, has stopped being an option for either side. Every government involved in this conflict is now locked into a logic where de-escalating first looks like losing, and that is precisely the kind of trap that turns a 4-day span of bad news into a months-long war nobody originally planned to fight.
So here's the question I actually want you sitting with, not the obvious one. It isn't whether America hits Iran harder again tonight. Based on the last 9 nights, it will, almost certainly, before this video finishes reaching half its viewers.
The real question is, what happens to Kuwait's power grid, Bahrain's naval base, and Jordan's fragile political balance, while the world's attention stays locked on the exchange of strikes between Washington and Tehran? Those 3 governments never chose this fight, and all 3 are now absorbing damage, both physical and political, that could outlast the war itself by years. If Jordan's public turns hard enough against hosting American forces, if Kuwait's water infrastructure takes another hit before it's repaired, if Bahrain's naval hub becomes an active target rather than a rear base, this stops being a story about the United States and Iran entirely. It becomes a story about which smaller Gulf states survived being caught in the middle of a war between two countries that were supposed to be sitting at a negotiating table in Doha this week, not trading airstrikes for a ninth straight night. That's the story still being written in real time, hour by hour. And it's worth watching closely, because the next headline out of this region may not even be about Iran at all. It may be about a country you weren't watching, absorbing a hit nobody warned you was coming.